So, Carlos, thank you for coming on to the Soul Sync podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to connect with you.
Now, I want to go straight into your story because I know we're going to have an absolutely action-packed hour here, and we've got a lot to talk about. Tell us about you and your story, because it's very interesting how you even came to come across ayahuasca. And as I said in the intro, it sounded like an absolutely catalyst of events happened to you with depression and drug addiction. But tell us about your story.
Oh man, I mean, everyone has a story that goes on for a very long time. 1 hour certainly wouldn't be enough to tell the story, so I'll have to pick out a few of the pieces, right, that seemed pertinent.
Hmm.
Um, Again, like thanks so much for giving me the chance to speak, and I hope that our conversation is beneficial for the listeners. Yeah, so I was a student at university. I decided to study philosophy, and I got a job on campus that provided me a good internet connection. I'm going to be 50 this year. So when I was in college, the internet was just coming out, and it wasn't common to have an internet connection. That wasn't like something that everyone has the way that we do now. And so to like be in a place that had an internet connection was a special thing. And so I gave myself my own project to do research on to pass the time, and to take advantage of the internet. And that was to study medicinal plants. It was something that I had just kind of stumbled upon somewhere along the line. I remember like getting a book on medicinal plants when I was 17 years old and being fascinated that so many plants anywhere, everywhere, in an abandoned lot in the city, there's all these medicinal plants that we don't know about. And I just love that concept. And in the study of medicinal plants, I stumbled across ayahuasca, and that was tremendously fascinating to me. It was one thing to look at plants from an allopathic perspective, where, oh, if you take this plant, it's good for this illness type of mentality.
Hmm.
But this was like a whole nother way of looking at it, where the plants had spirits that you could communicate with, that you could meet and build relationships with. And that was just absolutely fascinating to me, as was the concept of seeing spirits and being able to enter another dimension
Hmm.
of reality. So that kind of put ayahuasca on the top of my list of medicinal plants that I wanted to explore more.
Hmm.
And I so then I started reading books that were specific to that. Michael Harner's The Way of the Shaman, Terence McKenna wrote several different books. Him and his brother Dennis McKenna, and the Yahe letters from oh man, I want to say Ginsberg, but it wasn't Ginsberg, it was his contemporary. But anyway, I read books about ayahuasca and that intrigued me more. I began talking to people about it, at parties or whenever I would talk with friends, they would come up in conversation. And and that I think was what like put me on a path that would then play out when I spiraled into drug addiction after college, really, and in the process of like trying to become an adult, and I got a good job and I did like all these things that were taught is
Hmm.
the recipe for success, and yet it was actually making me feel less fulfilled, and I felt more despair. And that's when I turned to the self-soothing or coping mechanisms of drugs to like deal with, which I think is very common for so many people in today's society. And that led me to wake up in my car underwater one night, having blacked out behind the wheel of my car on drugs, and almost died. I literally had to climb out the window and swim to the shore, and then watch my car just go completely underwater and not know where I was or anything like that. That was a big wake up call for me, my rock bottom moment where I realized that I would die if I didn't make a big change in my life, and that I didn't want to die. And And then by what I view as divine synchronicity, I received an email from a close friend of mine who happened to be in Peru and happened to meet two men from Russia who were there working with a shaman. And she met them and decided she was going to drink ayahuasca, remembered that I had talked to her about it at some point and decided to write to me to see if I wanted to fly down and do it with her. I felt like the timing of that was beyond a coincidence, and I really viewed that as the universe providing me with an opportunity. And so I accepted that offer and in 2003 flew down to the Amazon rainforest for the first time to drink ayahuasca with a shaman named Don Juan Tangoa. And and to say that was a life-changing experience would be an understatement. It was a massive transformation in my life where I actually was able to identify and resolve the key roots of my trauma that I was really compensating for or trying to soothe or medicate with my drug use. And so my eyes were opened in such an unbelievable way. And during that time, the shaman told me it was my path to be a healer and that he would teach me if I wanted and invited me to become his student. So I accepted that offer, and in 2004, I moved to the Amazon rainforest and began living with him and his family, and I began studying the ayahuasca tradition with him. And after 4 years of living with him and working with him, I came up with the idea for the Ayahuasca Foundation, which we've founded in 2009. And now we've been operating that for the last 15 years. And about 10 years ago, we collaborated with a group of doctors that now call themselves Onaya Science and from the NHS. And the NHS actually, through the British Medical Research Council, funded the first ayahuasca research that was conducted at our center. Now we have moved on from that funding source to private funding, but we've continued to do that research, and it's published over a dozen articles in medical journals, some of which has been really groundbreaking.
The story is fascinating. You said that it was when the first time you took it, it was profound to say the least. How would you? Why was it profound? What was it in you that? How would you describe it?
Oh man, that's a good question. It's almost like trying to ask someone to describe what it felt like when they fell in love. But I saw things that I didn't really think were possible, and so I'll give you a couple of the key elements. Like the second ceremony, well, the first ceremony, I was incredibly confused, and I was having difficulty distinguishing reality from this visionary world. So I was seeing people and they were interacting with me, and it was almost like I was like in between worlds or in this dreamscape that would come in and out where I would find myself in a scene of a dream where I was in a different place with people that I knew were not actually there, but yet it all seemed so real, and it was very confusing and troubling, and I was really frightened. And and so it was a pretty terrible experience at the time. Like I really felt like that was maybe the worst thing that I'd ever done, and I actually thought I will never do this again. But thankfully, I was able to come to the understanding that it was my interpretations and my fear that really shaped how I perceived the experience. And so when I went back the second ceremony, I vowed to not be afraid. And very quickly, I realized how much the fear had influenced my perceptions and interpretations, such that without the fear, those same demons or those same
Hmm.
frightening experiences turned into angels and incredibly amazing experiences. And that was a very, very powerful lesson to learn. And in that second ceremony, a spirit came and put his hand on my shoulder, and I could feel him touching my shoulder, and I was looking at him with my eyes open, and I wasn't in a dreamscape. He was there in the room with me. So it was like a whole nother level of reality where I couldn't say dreaming because I was fully awake, but yet here he was. And at that moment, that friend who had contacted me to invite me to join her on this experience called out to me and said, "Carlos, I'm looking over at you and it looks like there's a man standing there." And I was like, "Yeah, I know. I'm looking at him, but he's a good guy." And she was like, "Are you sure? Because it's freaking me out." And I was like, "No, it's I can tell he's a good guy." And at that point, she could see him. I'm looking at him. The concept of what is real now got kind of cracked open. So I put my hand out, shook his hand, felt his hand in my hand as we shook, and then we began to communicate telepathically. And I recognized him to be someone that had been very important to me in my life who had passed away 4 years earlier. I hadn't been thinking about him. I wasn't calling out to him, but here he was. And that was an incredibly impactful moment for me that really shaped my perception of spirit. Before then, I think I thought spirit was like an energy, almost like if you could see it, it would be like a cloud, of something.
Mm.
But here was like a spirit, just like a person. It was a person, and it was the spirit of a person who had passed away. And yet here I was shaking hands with this person, talking to this person, and that really like shattered a lot of my preconceptions or what I had
Mm.
previously believed about so many things, about death, what happens to you when you die, and also specifically about
It
spirit. So
sounds to me that you had a belief in the spirit world before you did it, but it sounds to me that what happened to you was very profound. It sounded to me like there was some level of belief, but once you did it, it was almost like it must have shifted your whole world view.
definitely, yeah, without a doubt. Like I said, like I believe the concept of spirit because I believed that there was an energy that gave me my life, like my vibrancy, this energy in me that makes me alive. And then there will be the day when I don't have that energy and I will die. And so, that was like where I was at in terms of my belief. Yeah, there's something that like in me that makes me alive that won't be there when I die. And that's how I viewed like what spirit was. But like I said, it was kind of like this cloud of energy. But yet the solidity, like I could feel this man hand on my shoulder. I could feel his hand in my hand when we shook. I could see him with my eyes open. It became far more real than what I had attributed to it before. And I mean, and then that was really like the beginning. The third ceremony I went in and saw scenes from my childhood, which were incredibly impactful, that had been the seeds of trauma, and saw how they had played out in forming my behavior and my personality and my self-perceptions and all of these things that had eventually led to my addictions and my illnesses. And I mean, it was like seeing the truth. That's really what it felt like, where I had been like living under assumptions and now I knew the truth. And
Of
and while there was still,
existence, of the whole of existence.
yeah, I mean, that's really what it felt like. Like there was so much more than what I had previously thought. And I was fascinated by it. And I wanted to explore it to the furthest I could.
How did that change the way that you lived your life after that experience? What
Well,
changes?
I moved to the Amazon rainforest and began living in the jungle with a shaman. So I'd say it made some pretty big changes. But I will say that even when you are faced with such profound, like transformative experience are truths or my beliefs. And, I had a whole lifetime I was 28 years at that point. Like I had 28 years of creating my reality based on a incredibly complex set of beliefs that I had picked up along the way from personal experiences, from having learned things, from just being in a part of a culture and the context of that. And so it wasn't like you could just smash that all away. So
Mm,
much of that still lingered. So it really began the process of evolving that or shifting that. Now, some of those things definitely did feel like they were shattered. Like some foundational truths, I felt like they were just gone now. And some of that belief system kind of collapsed with it. But but it wasn't like I didn't become enlightened, essentially. Like I had what I felt like was an enlightening experience in the sense that the lights turned on and allowed me to see the truth in a way. But I still came back to who I was and how I perceive myself and the world. And then that process of making those shifts has been much more gradual. Like the last 20 years is I'm still in that process. But the concept of communicating with spirit became centered in how I viewed the world. Like I began to shift, if I were to try to sum it up, like I began to shift away from a physical centric perspective of life to a non-physical centric perspective of life or a spiritual centric.
moving to the rainforest, what made you want to that? Because that is such a big change of life. What what was it really driven by? Was there an element of fear that you didn't want to go back to? You weren't able to perhaps integrate back into normal life, having had revelations that were so big.
No, I could have. I feel like I did go back. I went, this was in June of 2003. So I did go back. I, quit my job. I moved out of my house, sold my car, moved all my possessions. If I didn't get rid of them, I stored some of them in my dad's house, broke up with my girlfriend. Like I tied up all these loose ends. And 6 months later, in January of 2004, is when I moved back to the Amazon. And, but no, it was a feeling that this was exactly what I was supposed to do. This was my destiny, and that if I didn't do it, I would just live the rest of my life in regret. And it was almost like I didn't have a choice, or that the choice was so obvious that it 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 had been made, whether I wanted to or not, and so the decision to go was really based on, if you realize what you feel like you are meant to do in your life, then do you have the choice whether or not to do it? Yes, you do. But if you are actually realizing what you are meant to do in your life, how could you choose not to do it? That was really how it felt.
When you go on an ayahuasca experience ceremony trip, is every experience very different, or does it always take a similar kind of structure? Because from what I've looked into it, it seems like the first couple of hours are very unpleasant. It's a when you go through, is it a purging state?
Oh, it's so hard to try to categorize like an experience. So my first my first four experiences, I would say, were very, very different. But I would attribute that partly to the experience itself, but mostly I would attribute it to how I was, like where I was or the state of being. So that first ceremony, I had a lot of anxiety. I'd never done it before, and the how different it was, like how strange and something I'd never experienced. And I had taken psychedelics before, but this was just on a whole other level. And that created a fear response in me, such that I then began to interpret all of my experiences through the context of fear. So I would say that I was in a state of fear. And in that state, it was incredibly unpleasant. But thankfully, the second ceremony, I had processed that experience a lot. I had spoken to the other people in the ceremony. One person in particular was very like impactful to demonstrate to me that this was more about me than it was about the ayahuasca. And so the second experience, I went in telling myself I would not be afraid. And then almost immediately there was this noticeable, observable response from the experience or from a spirit that I saw where it wasn't going to scare me because I wasn't afraid. And and so it really felt like at the time I remember thinking like I had been sending a message with my fear that this is what I wanted. And so they were like,
Mm,
"Oh, this guy wants me to scare him because that's what the energy he's
mm,
presenting. So wait till you see how I scare you, you know?" And then when I presented a different energy, which was not fear, the response was, it seemed, and again, this was my interpretation at the time, that it was like, "Oh, you don't want us to scare you. Instead, let me dazzle you." And then it became this like fascinating, dazzling experience for me. And that was so eye-opening. I'm saying it now, looking back. So at the time, I'm trying to like put it into the context of my
mm.
interpretation at the time. I hadn't, been able to articulate it that way, but nonetheless, the second ceremony was drastically different than my first because I was now being dazzled and now I was, you know, ready and willing and wanting more of this experience, where the first one I just wanted it to end, like please stop, I don't want this anymore because it's so terrifying. The second one I really feel like was very similar experience if you could somehow cut me out of it, but yet my interaction with it would became so different because I was in a different state of being. And then having that spirit come to me radically shifted my state of being to a whole nother level, where now my curiosity was just through the roof. Now I like my state of being, I want you to show me everything you can, I want to see it all. Like, and so then that was the response.
It sounds like
So
if your curiosity wasn't peaked before, then it certainly was the second time.
well, then you start to realize that there's actually no end to it. Like it becomes this infinite, it's like exploring the universe. You get to Mars and you're like, this is the most incredible thing I've seen. And then you're like, wait, there's a whole other galaxy? Wait, there's like star
Mm.
systems that I could never have possibly imagined. And all of that is now available. And now I have the opportunity to do that. And so getting back to your question, like how is it? It's very, very difficult because you can't really separate the experience from you. And therefore, each person is going to always be perceiving and interpreting their experience through the lens of their state of being, which is this incredibly complex combination of all of our beliefs and our perceptions. And some of that is going to be low frequency
Mm.
guilt, fear, shame, the effects of trauma or the effects of all of that. And some of that will be high frequency, love, joy, and gratitude, and the stuff in the middle with courage and acceptance and all of that. But each person will obviously be a unique collaboration of all of those frequencies that produce the way that we experience our reality. And that shifts per person. One day you might wake up and you're not in a good mood. Well, then all of a sudden, everything that you see, even the people that you love, are annoying, or they're
Mm.
frustrating, or they trigger you, or they tick you off. And then the next day you might feel wonderful, and now that same person that pissed you off yesterday, you want to give a big hug to and tell them how much you love them. And these other, like the baby crying that you were like pissed off that that mother
Mm.
isn't doing a good job. And now the baby crying is like, oh, the beautiful, expression of life that the universe had. Like we've all kind of seen all of those differences in our own experiences, and they demonstrate just how much our own state of being determines how we perceive and interpret our experiences outside of ourselves, even though we might attribute the experience to outside of ourselves. The majority of it is really within ourselves in how we tell that story, right?
I almost want to ask you, and I don't know if I'm asking you an impossible question to describe, but can you give us a couple of experiences or things that you've discovered as a result about the universe and consciousness as a whole that you discovered through your work with ayahuasca?
Sure. I think I probably would be hesitant to use the word discovered at this point. Although at the time, I think discovered would be a word that I would have chosen, and not to like try to get too analytical about words, but the word discover does imply that truth, right? And I did
Mm.
use that about what it felt like, but I was trying to describe how I interpreted it at the time. And so I would probably stick with interpret rather than describe at this, I mean, discover at this point.
Mhm.
Because I don't want to get locked in. Discovery, if you discover something, then it's probably going to be there when you go back and look for it later. But interpret,
Mm.
it might not be. Um,
It's
and
very
and
interesting you say that on that and pick up on that word because that in itself, I could draw a lot from that, from your experiences. It's never the same as it was before. It's always
right.
evolving and great. Yeah, makes sense.
Well, it also speaks to that openness to your mind where, if you discover that something is true and it's not beneficial to you, but you kind of get locked into it as the truth, well, now you're kind of stuck with a detrimental truth in your life.
Mm,
Whereas if you kind of are able to relax that discovery or that truth into a more malleable state that potentially could change or not, then you kind of open the door for opportunity to shift away from detrimental truths to the formation of a more beneficial way of seeing things so that you are healthier and happier in your life. You know what I mean?
yeah.
But I can describe something that I think is probably at the core of everything in my life, where I see myself as the collection of trillions of cells. I've read that it's like 50 trillion cells in the human body. An adult human has roughly 50 trillion cells, and each one of those cells is an individual. Each cell has a reproductive system, a circulatory system, an excretory system, all of these systems in one tiny little cell, and we are made of 50 trillion of them. We're also made of even more trillions of organisms that aren't my cells. They don't have my DNA. They're foreign. They're like bacterial cells and my gut flora and fauna and so there's this entire ecosystem that is me, and they're all playing this intricate collaborative game of what it means to be a human being. And each of those cells is made of 50 trillion atoms. And that's just me. That's just and you and each of us. And then I extrapolate out and say, well, what if this planet is literally just one electron in one atom that's 50 trillion of which make up just one cell, and 50 trillion of those cells make up this one giant body. And is that what God is? and and that's how I now like come to define what I think of as God. Now, I'm a conscious being. We're talking, I'm thinking about what to say. I certainly have consciousness. Do I know what consciousness is? I not really, but I'd like to think that it is in all of my cells. and that each of my cells has a little piece of consciousness. And collaboratively again, and along with all of those things that are not actually me, but that work together with me, all of those other cells of other organisms that don't contain my DNA, but yet we live together and work together in harmony, they have consciousness as well. And somehow I have the collection of consciousness that I do, but yet my consciousness then collaborates and combines with just an infinite consciousness that is unfathomable, and that would be the consciousness of God. And so it's accessible to us, as is the consciousness of beings that aren't in my body, and that goes beyond what I feel are the limitations of perception. And that would be another element of something that you could say I discovered or I've come to interpret, which is what we think of as reality is defined by our biological limitations. The visible spectrum contains 7 colors, and those refer to specific frequencies of light. And when you go below the frequency that we know to be red, or when you go above the frequency that we know to be violet, it's invisible. We can't see it, but the light is there. And our eyes can see it, but our minds can't access that perception or that perceptive information, as well
Mm.
as our ears. Our ears have a similar spectrum. The visible spectrum is limits what we can process in terms of our vision. Our audible spectrum limits that. All of our sense organs take in all of this information, but we only access a certain band or certain frequency spectrum of that information, and that's what we believe to be reality. But there's so much more. And with something like ayahuasca, we can actually expand what's really called the reduction of sensory gating. So we can actually reduce the blinders, or really open them, so that we our mind accesses a little bit more of that sensory information. And what we
Mm.
do with that sensory information is what makes it possible for us to heal. And that's why it feels like an enlightening experience, because it's quite literally the ability to see more and to feel more and to sense more. And when we have access to that increased sensory or expanded sensory information, we have an expanded state of awareness. And that is a tremendous value to us.
Everything which you said there made absolutely total sense. I was scribbling down because a lot of it was very profound. I think the way you articulated that, um, yeah, that made sense in my mind. Um, when you
Maybe
took,
I could, is it okay if I just go one step further? Because I think that this
mm,
might resonate with you a lot. And this is
yeah,
actually something that just came up for me in December, just a couple months ago.
hmm
Um, and that maybe is a testament that of just how long a process this is, right? Like
hmm
someone might think, oh, if you're doing this for 20 years, then you know, right? No, not even close. But I came to some articulation that well, I really like it, and I think it might help you to understand something as well. So those 7 colors in the visible spectrum, if we were to think of them as notes on a scale, a musical scale has 8 notes, but really it has 7 unique notes. Simplification would be A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then the eighth note is A again, but it's an octave higher. And so our reality could be perceived as an octave. We live in this octave. Now, there's a lot of octaves below us, and there's a lot of octaves above us, or lower frequency and higher frequency. And those are talked about in the indigenous cosmology as the lower worlds and the higher worlds. And that's not just within the Amazonian, those are a cosmology that's near universal. And And so by putting them into the context of the frequency, I think they become more tangible to us. So we really live in those seven notes of our scale, but that eighth note is what we share with the octave above us. And that's the first note of the next scale. And if we were to consider that higher world or higher dimension, the world of spirit, then the eighth note is where they overlap. And so if we can tune into that eighth note, we can bring ourselves into communion and communication with the beings of that octave above us.
Mm.
And that is, to me, a way of understanding what shamanism does. It allows that overlap of our eighth note, which is the first note of the spirit world, to create the opportunity for communication and communion. And through that, we can derive great insight to help us in our lives.
I think that was such a good analogy. It made really sense. And so I think sometimes this is where even I can get with the lower world, the upper world, and whatever. It can seem like it's somewhere so inaccessible because of the fact that you're saying by using word realms. But I think the way you describe it in octaves makes sense. You know, that's there is a blending between the worlds, but I think that's a really good analogy. That made really because you can tell when you're making these analogies that you have lived and experienced that because uh, you can tell the amount of processing that's had to go on for you to get to a place of being able to create such an analogy. When you take the ayahuasca, are you only doing it to so long that you never get to a point where it's recreational? It is serves a purpose, it's there, and you only use it if it's needed. Like, do you still need it now or use it now or have these experiences now? Or how?
Definitely.
Right.
I mean, if I ever met someone who said they didn't need it, I would say, well, you just haven't realized because I just don't think that they're, I mean, unless I meet Buddha, and like maybe one day that will happen. But I guess another way that I find to help like make the intangible tangible is that I like to use a scale of negative 100 to positive 100, with zero being the neutral point. And so anything in the negative spectrum would be deemed unhealthy, and everything in the positive deemed healthy. So if a person is unhealthy, then it's just a metaphor. There's not a specific measurement, but let's
Hmm.
just say someone self evaluates and they say, well, I'm probably around negative 20. For them to move from negative 20 to plus 10 is a massive amount of healing. That would be tremendous amount of healing, and they could legitimately say at that point, I am healthy. And
Nice.
they would also be legitimately saying, I have been healed. Both of those statements would be true, except they would still have from 10 to 100 ahead of them. And I just don't think anybody gets to 100. I mean, we should all strive for it, but there's always going to be that
Work to be
improvement we can
done.
make. Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Now, I should say, like, if you're negative 50 and you move from negative 50 to negative 40, that is healing. You might
Mm.
not be healthy yet, but you have been healed also. And yes, there's still work to be done. And I like that spectrum because I think the words maybe and kind of make things black and white where, well, if you're healed, then why do you have any problems? You're like, no, come on. That, like, yes, I was healed, but I still have a lot of things that I need to work out.
How do you, I want to come on to talk about the Ayahuasca Foundation and the work that you do there. Obviously, we talked about some of the journals and reports that have been published. But with your work at the foundation, how do you see the future of consciousness-based healing evolving, especially in terms of accessibility and acceptance within the mainstream healthcare systems?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you so much for asking that question because that is what I really feel speaks to my true passion. What I feel is like narrowing down what I think my path in life is and what my destiny is. Um, and I alluded to it a little bit in that shift I mentioned about away from the physical focused or physical centric perception to a non-physical centric perception. That's my hope. That's what my dream really is because I think that the modern medical industry is very, instead of physical, I'll call it material, is
Mm.
very material centric. And so it interprets everything through the lens of the material world. And such that if you have depression, you have a chemical imbalance. You have depression, you feel sad, you have negative thoughts, which are non-material elements, but yet you have a chemical imbalance. The material is how it's explained. And therefore, to treat it, you need to change your chemistry. So here's some pills that will change your chemistry. And that's pretty much proven to be not very effective. Some people do have some benefit from taking antidepressant medications, but overall, we've seen the literature now for decades, and it's just not that effective.
I suppose
And to
part of the
me,
problem
that's
is we're commoditizing health, aren't we? Health has become um, something that makes money.
yeah, that's a big part of it. But I mean, man, that's a whole nother topic, and I agree with you 100%.
Mm.
But I don't know how much I'm going to be able to do that. I feel like my contribution would be to reintroduce or acknowledge to a greater degree, which I think is as important, if not more important, the non-material elements of our being. And that is consciousness. Amazingly, we know the placebo effect. No one denies the placebo effect in modern medicine. Everyone can't deny that phenomenon. But yet it is not really given any attention, nor do we implement the awareness of the placebo effect, which is the power of consciousness, into our treatments, which is strange, I think. If you have verifiable evidence that a person's consciousness alone can heal them of an illness, wouldn't you want to study how that happened? With all of your intellect and energy. Like that's what I think is the most important. And that's what I see psychedelic traditions, especially the ayahuasca tradition, they are really the science of consciousness. It is such a beautiful ideology that instills faith. So when someone goes to their shaman, they're they're going with this belief system already intact. And even when someone from our culture flies down to the Amazon, they have some degree of that faith already there, or some degree of that trust before it maybe reaches that faith. But the shaman has very solid faith in the non-material elements, the spiritual dimension, the communication with
Mm.
nature, such that when you're in their presence, you can't help but also increase the level of trust that you have. And as we like increase our frequency or improve our state of being, now we change our perceptions, now our interpretations start to change, and now we begin to open the doors for opportunities of healing that just wouldn't exist in the modern material perspective. And an example of that is maybe people are listening who are taking pharmaceutical medication. How many of you love your pharmaceutical medication? How many of you feel gratitude and joy when you open up that pill bottle and take that pill? Or how many of you feel low frequency energy, that you hate your medication, that you wish that you didn't take it, that you that it it brings about a low frequency
You know what? That's a
response in
really
you.
interesting thing you're saying now. I've never even thought about that in that way. But I don't think there's anyone out there that probably looks in that. Well, I guess some people that might be very thankful to be on a life-saving treatment, but the majority of us human beings, I think that we have negative connotations when it comes to medication and pills, which you're
Right.
right. And then you are putting something in your body with a low frequency from the get-go. That's a
It's like
very,
calling
hmm,
if you're like, "Oh man, I need help. Who should I call? I hate that person. Should I call them or should I call this person I love?"
uh,
Like, of course, you call the person that you love when you need help. You don't call the person that you hate. And that to me is we're kind of in a process like that. Whereas with plant medicines, you automatically love that the plants have made this medicine for you. It's like there's a divinity instilled in the ideology that is it's almost like can't be doubted. It's like, I'm a part of nature and nature
hmm,
made this and I'm so thankful. Thank you to these plants. And we don't have that. And I think that we could, to be honest, I honestly think that we could have it to some degree. I'm not saying that we should just abandon all pharmaceutical medications, but I do think that we should acknowledge and then also work towards bringing a better alignment with our consciousness and our medication. Because if you think that you're going to heal yourself with something you hate, that doesn't resonate with me very well, as opposed to healing
hmm.
with something I love.
What do you have a similar view of anything that derives from a plant? So, say people that choose to take magic mushrooms, or for instance, smoke cannabis, which is now becoming legal. Do you think that if they are used in a spiritual way, then it's a good thing? Or what's your view generally on all these different substances that derive from plants? Because I guess the history of a lot of them dates back to shaman, Celtic, Druid times.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I exactly feel that. I mean, that's what I've been talking about in terms of state of being. So if I take a plant medicine, but I take it because I want to escape my problems, because I want to, get fucked up, which is a weird term that we use that is like very common. People want to get fucked up,
Mm.
which I hope it's okay that I just said that on your podcast. But
Oh, you say what you want on the podcast.
but then you will, like,
Mm.
okay, great, you got fucked up, good for you, but what's going on there? And so and that's the same with pharmaceutical medications. Some people, they've literally saved their lives because of certain pharmaceutical medications, and other people are getting fucked up on that same pharmaceutical medication.
Mm.
And so your intention and your state of being, your reasoning, all of that is, I think, very, very important. And we know that to be true. If anyone has ever given you a gift, you don't necessarily evaluate the quality of the gift on what it is. You evaluate the quality of the gift based on the complexity of those intentions, right? Someone might give you a gift because they want you to do something for them. That's what that gift means, right? They might give you a gift because they want you to think that they're special or powerful or super cool or something. That's what that gift means. Or they might give you a gift because they love you and they want you to be happy as possible. That's what that gift means. And it could be the exact same gift. And so we know that's like a really important, if not the most important aspect of the material world, is really the non-material elements that drive it, right? Like someone, if someone kills someone using a scalpel as a tool, as a weapon, well, that person should be locked up and thrown in jail. But if a doctor unsuccessfully performs a surgical procedure trying their best to save someone's life with that same scalpel, well, you don't throw that person in prison,
Mm.
and
Mm.
the material might be very similar, But
Yeah.
because of the non-material elements, we really use those more to dictate our lives. I just think we need to have more inclusion of the non-material awareness and elements of our health because I think that that would bring about better outcomes. I think it's obvious.
Mm, that's so interesting. What advice would you give to anyone potentially looking at ayahuasca as a potential treatment for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Ayahuasca or any treatment. And I'll give you an example right now. Like my father is going through some health issues right now, and he's in a place where he really needs to choose a treatment plan. And and so he and I are working on that and discussing it. And as anyone probably does, they seek advice and they get it and people are all over the place, like, oh, my brother was healed doing this, you should do this, and oh, I know somebody that used this and you should do that. And we it's tough to navigate,
Mm,
especially if we
mm,
don't have already like a particular leaning. Like I obviously would have a very strong leaning towards one treatment plan if I were to have a problem. And what it really comes down to is what I use the term resonate, like what you resonate with most or what you feel the most trust or faith in. And so if that is ayahuasca, then definitely that is the best path for you. Now, how do you know if you don't know? Well, then you would want to do that research. You would want to like really think about it, read books, talk to people, get that advice and hear those options. But essentially, it's going to be really what you feel in your heart. And so I guess that's how it distills. Use your heart to make that decision rather than your head, because your heart is really the one that determines how much you believe in something. And in your head puts all of those thoughts to describe those, but your head doesn't really make good decisions. But your heart will never leave you stranded. It will always guide you towards your best outcome. So if you follow your heart in making that decision and do what feels right to you, and that's what I hear people say, like, I just felt like this was the way to go. And some people, I just knew. When someone contacts me and like, I just know this is the path I should take. Well, I already know, like, yeah, you're going to be successful. And the trouble is when someone's like, I don't really know what to do.
mm.
And man, we all find ourselves in that place sometimes, which is why our heart is the better source to try to navigate through that. And our brains, they confuse us more than they help us most of the time. But our
I do.
hearts, that they speak a better language if we can tap into that.
Carlos, this has been the most wonderful conversation. I can't believe we've been talking for an hour already, and I feel like we've barely even scratched the surface on the world of um, ayahuasca. If people want to find out more about you and the foundation, where can they go to?
Our website is definitely the best place to start. So that's ayahuascafoundation.org. And we are on all social medias. I don't use social media that much, but all of those links are on the website. If you use the contact us form on the website too, that goes straight to me. So if you do want to communicate directly to me, I try my best to respond to every email I get.
Carlos, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much for your time and coming on to the Soul Sync today to spread the message and the love about the world of healing and ayahuasca.
Thanks so much for having me again. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.